Hello everyone and welcome back to Introduction to Sociology. It's me, Instructor Glenn. Today we're going to be talking more about the sociological imagination, a little bit more from a perspective of a historical or life course standpoint approach. And so another aspect of the sociological imagination is that it exists at the intersection of history and biography. And so this was an idea that was advanced by the American sociological theorist C. Wright Mills in a quote of his that's actually been well publicized among sociology classes that is the same general idea. So it's the same idea, which is that the sociological perspective and the social experience both exist at the intersection of history and biography. Now, what does this mean exactly? Because sometimes people get confused about these terms. What is history? You know, history is a topic. History is a major. History is something you can write a book about. History is not just one story. It's fungible. So history is his story. History gets to be told by the victors. Nevertheless, for our purposes in this context, history is going to refer specifically to the idea that we all occupy a specific and very unique moment in the historical milieu, in the progression of time, and in the marching on of history. The particular moment that we just happen to be born at is distinct and characterizes our experience of the world and our understandings of it and our perspectives on things and how we deal with things and how we can deal with things and what are the resources that we even have available to deal with things. All of these aspects of our very lives are shaped by our historical moment. And so another way to say history in sociology is to say socio-historical context. So that's a really fancy word, but it refers broadly to not just what year is it, what time period is it, temporally how are we measuring that aspect of things, but it also looks at what is the geographic situation. Are you in a country that's surrounded on all sides by water? Are you in a country that is surrounded on all sides by other countries? Another aspect is the political situation in the country. If the political situation in a country is very fraught or it has a very dangerous dynamic, then that can really impact the life chances for people in that historical moment. So for example, for the Sudanese Lost Boys, who were displaced by decades of war and fighting and terrorism in Sudan and Africa, those young men had to march for hundreds and hundreds of miles through multiple countries and deserts and risk getting eaten by lions and shot by hunters and soldiers in order to finally find themselves in Ethiopia or some other similar country that may or may not want them now. Or maybe they found themselves in America and now they are struggling with a language barrier issue. And so immigration and refugee status is a very serious issue impacting the whole world right now. We have just extremely high levels of refugees in the world without a place to live, without any nation to call the home and to protect them. And that aspect of this historical moment is really shaping life for those individuals, but it's also shaping life for the rest of us because while those individuals struggle to survive the perils of being a refugee and all that that means, and being homeless and out on the sea, being persecuted, those individuals are not often able to contribute productively to society. They can't contribute to the economies of the places where they are necessarily, if they're just being bounced around all the time. Um, they can't lead unbroken uh, lives, in the sense that like they're very much being bounced around and moved around, um, and so that is going to really impact them in terms of the historical moment that they're living in right now. And so when we think about the sociological perspective, history is very important. There's also some research or news reports coming out of even refugees, I think, from Syria, who find themselves in other countries, but they are now like in a coma. They're like even children. Just something psychologically about the trauma of being a refugee causes some of them to actually go into a comatose state. And so these are significant problems associated with our moment in history. Um, and so history is one half of it, but history intersects or cuts across or cuts through individual experiences in important ways. And so that's what biography means. And so people hear biography and they think like a book written about someone or someone's like whole life story. And yes, that is true and relevant in this context. But biography also in this context refers to um, how have all of your sum total life experiences up until this point um, been shaped by your historical context, so that intersection, but also how do they then further impact the things that you are more or less likely to experience. And so the intersection of history and biography is important for understanding the sociological perspective, because no one is raised or exists in a vacuum. Everyone is a part of some context or some culture or some milieu environment that they may or may not even be fully conscious or aware of, that really shapes their opportunities. And so when you're thinking about the sociological perspective, be sure to remember that it occurs at the intersection of individual personal biographies and life stories and wide-scale historical moments and social structure to create a very unique and individual point of view or perspective for you, right in the middle there. And so if I were to use an example of this from my own life, I grew up in a small, rural, conservative, and largely religious town in upstate New York. And I was in 8th or ninth grade when 9/11 happened. And after that, I noticed a great deal of stereotypes and anti-Islam and xenophobic or fear of strangers sentiment expressed by the people around me at the time. And so, of course, like a large part of this was to do with the fact that 9/11 had just happened, this major traumatic national event that has become a real turning point for our nation and for a lot of people in their lives, to the extent that like nothing has been since maybe Pearl Harbor. Part of that was also that it was a relatively small, racially homogenous or racially the same town. A lot of people were white, and a lot of people didn't really have that much experience with people from other walks of life. And so growing up at this intersection of being me, and being an empathetic person, being an intrigued person, and being a social oriented person, I also experienced this context in which I was often surrounded by um, vitriol and sometimes even hate speech about Muslim individuals and sometimes people of color. And that deeply impacted me in a way that I really wanted to become a sociologist and go into this field where I could work to try to combat those types of stereotypes and try to teach people that not everyone is the same. And in fact, most people are okay. And so I think one of the first people to really expose me to a sociological understanding of this particular topic was a high school English teacher who taught our class about the pillars of Islam, the Muslim faith, and how for people who commit crimes in the name of Allah or the Muslim God in Islam, those individuals are practicing a controversial version of Islam, in which they kind of stick an additional sixth pillar onto the end of the original five pillars, and then they say, like, now you must also wage holy war or jihad. And so my teacher taught us this at a very important time, I think, in our lives, right after 9/11, in a very important place, all white, Christian, conservative, small town. Um, and I think it really did shape me in a lot of ways, because now it is important to me to take that objective perspective on social life. And so this has been your, excuse me, lecture on the intersection of history and individual biography. And tune in next time for our next lecture on social structure.